Yo, what's going on, guys? It's your boy. Welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be talking about Alien Romulus again. I'm really excited to talk about this movie more. I really enjoyed it. It is one of my favorite horror movies that has came out this year. I think I have it ranked number 2. And overall, I do think it is the scariest movie I personally have ever seen. I've kind of had a little journey on this channel going through and watching a bunch of old horror movies and trying to find horror movies that scare me. And I will admit, I am purposely kind of skipping some that I know are going to give me nightmares. And this one was pretty terrifying. It had everything that I wanted in a horror movie, and I really enjoyed it. But while I was watching this movie, it kind of reminded me of some other films, and today we're going to be doing an episode of a show I don't get to do often called Feels Familiar. And I want to address something before I get too far into this video. I'm going to be comparing Alien Romulus to a couple of other movies, a couple of other franchises, and I'm not by any means saying that Alien Romulus copied stuff from those movies. I'm also not saying that it is better or worse than those movies. I'm just talking about how when I watched this movie, I really enjoyed it, and it reminded me of other movies that I also relatively, for the most part, enjoyed, and I think that that's cool, and I like being able to kind of connect those dots and making it so if anybody else watched this movie and was randomly like, oh, I kind of felt like this subplot was really similar to that other thing that happened in this other movie, they could be like, oh my god, he saw it too, and that's awesome. Because one thing about me, I do have like slight ADD, and sometimes my brain kind of like goes all over the place, and I will see something and I'll be like, yo, this character is kind of like this character from this movie, and then I'll kind of start noticing similarities that other people might not notice. So I'm just going to be talking about like 4 or 5 other movies that kind of I got reminded of when I was watching Alien Romulus, if that makes sense. So that being said, let's go ahead and dive right into this, shall we? So I'm going to be starting off with one that mostly just kind of connects to a big spoiler to Alien Romulus. So if you haven't seen Alien Romulus, maybe click off this video, maybe watch it later. But that being said, Big Hero 6 is very similar to Alien Romulus, and mostly because in Alien Romulus, one of the main characters is a guy named Andy, and he is a synthetic being. He's an AI, and he's not real. And something that's really interesting about him is they kind of refer to him as like, you know, manufacturer error or whatever. He has a lot of issues with him. He's not a great piece of technology, and every once in a while he'll need to be rebooted, and they'll need to do stuff to kind of like reset him in the movie. And in his head, he has this little disk drive that when you take it out, you can add more like technology and stuff to it, and then put it back in his head, and then he'll have like a new memory drive. And I thought that that was awesome, and it really reminded me of Big Hero 6, which is one of my favorite movies of all time, because in that movie they do stuff similar to it with Hero. Whenever he's like, okay, we need to teach Baymax how to fight, so then he programs a new disk drive with a bunch of like fighting stuff, and he makes him a total badass, like, you know, punchy kicky kind of guy. And it reminded me of that because in this movie, eventually they are putting in different drives into Andy's head, and he's not acting like himself. He seems very different from the kind of guy we're used to him being. He's making decisions that are less empathetic than they're used to Andy being, and it feels very jarring, and it feels very like evil. Like you can't even recognize this version of this person anymore because what is happening. And they eventually realize it's the disk drive, and they have a really hard time trying to get him to open up so that they can take the disk drive out. And that reminded me a lot of Big Hero 6 because they do essentially the same thing in Big Hero 6. In Big Hero 6, Baymax gets the punchy, kicky, you know, disk drive in his head, and eventually Hero takes out his medical chip and like takes out the loving and kind and compassionate version of Baymax that we know and love, and he becomes more of a like robot that's just fighting and being very aggressive, and they don't really know how to like stop that from happening. And eventually they'll be able to get into his head and switch out that drive, and they do that in both of these movies, and I think in both of these movies it works really well. And I honestly think that that's such a fun little like kind of detail to add towards AI characters in the future. I really loved everything they did with the synthetic in this movie, and as somebody who's a really big fan of sci-fi, I hope that in the future if they make more movies with AI characters, it is more like Andy in this film. And I just thought that that was a really cool, fun connection that I could make. But speaking of Andy and speaking of AIs, I gotta compare this to one of the biggest AI related movies that has came out in the last couple of years. Last year, the movie The Creator. This movie came out, and it was a huge blast. The sci-fi elements and everything to it were really interesting, and that entire movie, something that they were really trying to sell us on is the AIs have their own livelihood. They are people too. They have the same emotions and feelings that we feel. They've gotten to a point where they are practically equals with humans. And I feel like this movie does a lot of very similar stuff with that. They constantly are treating the AIs as they are less than human. And Andy is constantly actually arguing with one of the members of the team in Alien Romulus. And he's constantly making jokes at him, picking fun at him, being like, you're not a real human. And I think that this movie did a much better job making us empathetic towards the AI than the entirety of the movie The Creator. And that made me really sad, because for The Creator, there was a giant like war going on that was kind of like, okay, here's the people who are pro AI, here's the people who are against AI, and it kind of almost made it into kind of like a meta commentary on like, you know, like the civil rights movements and stuff like that. And it definitely did a good job of kind of showing how like history repeats itself. People constantly are going to be discriminatory against people who aren't like themselves, and AI in the future, if it does actually get to a point where AIs are practically humans and they practically have their own emotions and they have their own like brain and soul and purpose in life, it's going to be hard to kind of integrate them into society, because people don't like what isn't like themselves. And I think that this movie did a really good job with Andy, making him very human, making him somebody we care a lot about. And the fact that starting off this movie, him and Kaylee Spaney's character were, you know, incredibly close. She's doing everything she can to look after him. He's doing everything he can to look after her. And just that connection and that relationship between a person and an AI person was really well done. I really loved the emotional drive that it had in this film. And I think that they had a lot of really powerful moments where you can tell that even though one is technically a robot and they don't have emotions, he does. And there's a lot of moments, in fact, where he's like, I have to do what's best for the team. And he's smiling, but you can see in his eyes that he is devastated. And I just gotta shout out that actor, David Johnson, in this movie. Incredible stuff. I want to see him in every movie ever now, because he is fantastic and I absolutely loved his performance here. But yeah, those were two of the main ones that I wanted to touch on. I really wanted to touch on The Creator because I feel like for the most part, Alien Romulus actually felt more like a sci-fi movie than a horror movie until like the last like 20 minutes of the film. And so I wanted to touch on The Creator because that's another huge sci-fi movie that's came out recently. But now the last couple of ones I want to talk about, this one that I'm going to talk about actually has a lot in common with this movie. But because it is such a niche movie that I'm not sure a lot of people have seen, and I don't even think it's possible to watch it anymore. Last year there was a movie that came out called The Crater, and it was a little fun road trip movie starring a bunch of kids. They're in outer space, and they're on this like planet, or they're on the moon or something like that, and they're in this mining company, and the mining company is practically treating all of the miners as slaves, and they're kind of making them work in, you know, unfair conditions. They're constantly being overworked, and they're being promised that eventually one day they're going to be able to go to this new planet that has this new colony and everybody's going to be safe and it's going to be fantastic. And they're kind of promising, you know, hope for the future generations that, like, if you guys just keep mining, eventually you guys are going to be set free. And in this movie, they do essentially that as well. In Alien Romulus, they are living on a planet where there's a bunch of mining colonies. There's a bunch of people trying to just work and do whatever they can to get by. They have to meet specific quotas. And then whenever they finally hit those quotas, they're like, surprise, the quotas actually doubled. So 6 years from now, you might be able to be free. And it's a very devastating futuristic outlook, and I definitely think that it's something that could potentially happen in real life, like if we ever were to get to like moon colonies and stuff like that. So the fact that they're diving into like that lore and that world building, I think is really fascinating. And like I said, it reminded me of the movie The Creator because they had a very similar story. And The Creator, for people who do not know, I don't know if I mentioned this, it was a Disney Plus original movie that came out last year, and it was taken off of Disney Plus about like 3 months after it came out. And something specifically about it that is really heartbreaking is one of the main characters, his father passes away, but purposely makes it look like an accident, because if a parent dies in the mines or whatever, and the kid is not then orphaned, the kid is actually allowed to go to the new colony where everything is significantly better. And it's really interesting. It's a very emotional and deep story that I definitely was not expecting for a Disney Plus original. And I really liked that. And I really appreciate this movie for reminding me that that movie exists, because like I said, that was on Disney Plus. It was a Disney Plus original, and I don't think it's there anymore. So I don't know if it's even possible to go watch that movie anymore, which really sucks because it was a fun movie, and McKenna Grace was in it, and I love everything McKenna Grace is in. Okay, and now the last two I'm going to compare this to. These are both going to be really quick and simple because there's very minor things that it reminds me of. But specifically, the setting, this movie is like an outer space movie, and there's a lot of elements of it that's like, oh, it's going to be in outer space. They're on a spaceship. They're on an alien planet, and they're going to see aliens, obviously, because the title is Alien Romulus. But it takes place primarily on a space station, and this reminded me a lot of the movie that came out last year called The Meg 2, which was like, oh, it's going to be really cool. You're going to see a megalodon. They're going to be going very, very deep underwater, and there's going to be so many cool prehistoric creatures. And then it spends the majority of the film on an underwater, like, space bunker. What? I just combined the two movies. But Meg 2, the majority of the film is taking place on, like, a little bunker that's at the bottom of the ocean. And the setting for that and the setting for this movie felt very similar to me. And there was a lot of, like, okay, we're gonna... one character needs to get from this place to that place in X amount of time. And it just kind of had a very similar ticking clock to the Meg 2. But that being said, unlike the Meg 2, Alien Romulus was actually really good. And the Meg 2 was a movie. And then the last one I want to talk about, this is just so small and niche, and I honestly don't even really necessarily fully remember feeling like, oh my god, yeah, this is like this thing. But in this movie, they have, you know, the xenomorphs, the popular aliens that you're typically seeing, and they have like the ones that like face huggers. I don't know if they have a specific name, but the one that you see on the poster, see how I threw that up on the screen? Very demure, very mindful. Anyways, I'm sorry about that. That's a TikTok thing right now. I'm going to rewatch this video in 2 weeks, and I'm going to be like, what does that even mean? No idea. It doesn't matter. But those little face hugger monsters kind of reminded me a lot of these little guys. Once again, you see the picture on the screen. You see how I did that? I'm proud of my future editing self. He's killing it right now. But for people who don't know what that bug is from, it's from the weird, it's called Hero's Duty video game that's in Wreck-It Ralph. And every single time they had scenes where there's just like a bunch of the xenomorphs and there's just a bunch of those little bug guys and they're all surrounding her and she's kind of have to wipe them out and murder them all. That's all I can think about was that end scene in Wreck-It Ralph where there's just a bunch of those bugs literally all over the place. And yeah, it was really interesting. And the way that this movie kind of ended in was just like a shooter video game was kind of interesting. Like Kaylee Spaney did a lot of really fun action stuff, and not the final act because it's like 30 minutes before the movie ends, but there's a scene where she like turns off the gravity and she just goes crazy and starts like murdering a bunch of those little creatures. And yeah, it literally felt like the Wreck-It Ralph video game to me. But yeah, that being said, that was pretty much everything I wanted to talk about in this video. Thank you guys so much for coming by and checking out this little journey with me. If you guys also saw the movie and was like, oh my god, yeah, I totally feel that. That's awesome. If you didn't, I'm sorry. But that being said, I appreciate you guys so much for coming by and checking it out. I love and appreciate you guys so much for watching. And if you liked it, feel free to like and subscribe. I'm gonna head out now. Peace out. Bow, bow, bow.